Welcome to the online worship experience for Renascent Church. We are so glad that you've chosen to gather with us today. Am I allowed to call it gathering? I mean, we're in different places, we're in different houses today, and we're scattered all across the city, but I'm so thankful that we have the opportunity to gather together digitally through the incredible technology that we have. I know that if you're like me, you've probably gotten to the point where you've hit a wall. And this isolation, this distancing has gotten you to where you're just about ready to pull your hair out. And it's easy during this time to complain about a lot of stuff. So what I wanted to do today to start our worship gathering time off is I wanted to encourage you to focus your mind on the positive, to focus your mind on the good that is happening right now. So what I'm going to do is we're going to, in just a second, we're going to pause the video. And we're going to give you a moment to talk together in your house with whoever it is that you're there with. If it's just you, then you can talk with the Lord about this. But I want to encourage you to take a moment and share with each other at least one thing that you have to be thankful for right now. Focus your mind on one positive praise that you have, and just pause the video right now. And go around the room and share that one thing with each other. Do it and see how it changes your attitude today. Did you do it? Did you pause it? If you didn't, pause it now. I'm not kidding. Stop the video and go back and talk about something that God has done. And I feel like our praises will really set the mood for where we're headed today. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to spend a moment with you in prayer, thanking God for all the good that you've just talked about. And then we're going to continue to move forward in our worship experience. Would you pray with me? Father, we are so grateful that we have a lot to be thankful for right now. We're thankful that even in this time of difficulty, in this time of change, in this time of isolation, we have so much to be thankful for. We're thankful for your provision, and we're thankful for the sweet things that we miss, that we're now more appreciative of because of the distance. God, we're thankful for how you constantly take care of us. We're thankful for health. We're thankful for the loved ones that we have around us. God, we are thankful for so much today. Don't let us get so caught up in the negative impact of this time of isolation that we fail to see you in it. So God, as we move forward in our time of worship, we pray that you would be honored because of the praises that we send your way. We want our minds and our hearts to be focused on the right thing today. So right now, straight out of the gate, we praise you and we love you. We can't wait to see what you have in store for us today. We pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Do you have anybody in your life that you would say you trust implicitly? I doubt it. I mean, you might say it, but I doubt there's anyone in your life that you don't at least question from time to time. Even if you have like the highest level of trust for your spouse or maybe your parents or your best friend or some other loved one, I would guess that there are at least sometimes, every now and then, that make you stop and ask, wait a second, can I really trust what he just said or what she just said? I mean, I think about my life. I trust my wife a lot. There is no one else on this earth who I trust more than Erin. More than anybody else, I believe wholeheartedly that she has my best interest at heart. But there are still some times, every now and then, there are some times that I will pause and wonder whether or not I can really trust something that she just said. Not because I believe she's being deceitful or something like that, but just because I wonder whether or not she has all the facts. Usually those times are trivial, they're inconsequential, sometimes they're even silly. I mean, I actually shared with our small group this week about how when we talked about trust, that this wasn't always the case with me and Erin, that early in our marriage, I had to learn to trust her more and more. And unfortunately for me, a lot of that came from learning that the hard way. I can remember walking up on her and one of her best friends talking one day early in our marriage, and when I walked up, they just abruptly quit talking. About whatever it was that they were talking about, I don't know, but naturally my curiosity kicked in, and so I asked, "What are you ladies talking about?" And Erin replied something along the lines of, "Oh, don't worry about it, you don't want to know." So naturally, I did what any God-fearing, godly, loving husband would do. It made me want to know even more, so I pressed and I pried, and I kept pressing until eventually she got exasperated enough to tell me. And when she told me what they were talking about, girl things, I found out really quickly that I actually didn't want to know. I should have trusted her. And now after 15 years of marriage, if she's talking with another lady and they stop talking when I get close or walk into a room, I don't even ask. I just turn around and I go the other way. I don't want to know what they're talking about. I don't want to know anything about birthing issues or monthly reminders or anything else that God never intended for boys to talk about. Period. I trust her. If she tells me now, just trust me, you don't want to know, and I don't want to know. Over the years, I've learned to trust her more and more. And so here's a question I want you to think about. Who do you trust the most in your life? Is it a spouse? Is it a parent? A best friend? A pastor? Okay, I kid you. Who do you trust? Who is it that you trust the absolute most of anyone else on the earth? Get that picture in your mind. Go ahead and get a picture of the person that you're thinking of, and I want you to hold that picture in your mind. For some of you, it might be somebody that's sitting in the room with you right now. For others, that person might be halfway across the country. But I want you to think about them just for a second and ask yourself this question. How does my level of trust in that person compare to how much I trust God? I'm not asking you in order to shame you. I'm not asking you to compare these two things in order to make you feel bad about your level of trust of God. What I really want to do is to get you to think about this. I genuinely want you to think about it. How does your trust of God compare to the level of trust that you have in other people? For many people, the answer is that we trust some people a whole lot more than we trust God. For other people, we might say that we trust God way more than we trust anyone else on this earth. Maybe we've been burned so much that God is our only source of trust. Wherever you fall on this spectrum, whether you're trusting God more or you're trusting people more, I feel like whether you feel like you're this trust giant or trust champion, or you feel like you're a total failure when it comes to trusting God with your life, I feel like today's passage is for you. In this time of total uncertainty, with all that's going on in the world, with the world seemingly falling apart all around us, I thought that today we could all use a word of encouragement about trusting God more today. I know that sometimes it's easy to get discouraged, especially when we read the stories that we read in the Bible of these spiritual giants of the faith, and we see how they trusted God in their difficulties. We see their faith and we think, why can't I be more like them? Why can't I have that? But today's passage is actually written by Paul, who is arguably the greatest spiritual giant of all time. And yet in this passage, we see that even Paul had to learn how to trust God in his difficult times. And he learned that lesson the same way that we learn most of our spiritual lessons. He learned it the hard way. So if you've got your Bibles, we're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 today. And I want you to see how Paul learned a few lessons the hard way about trusting God. So let's look at it today, and let me show you what I mean. In 2 Corinthians 12:7, we read, "So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations," we'll talk about what revelations he's talking about in just a second. He says, "A thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, with insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, before we dive into the meat of this passage, let me start with just kind of a disclaimer, this caveat, this side note. We really have no clue exactly what this thorn was. When he says, God gave me a thorn in the flesh, no matter how much digging we've done, we can't figure out exactly what that is. Some people, some scholars would say that it's this physical problem, such as bad eyesight that Paul might have had, or maybe he had epilepsy. Some people would say that it's more of a spiritual problem than a physical one. They'd say it's something like temptation or depression. And the fact of the matter is that no matter how much we talk about it, we really have no idea. All we really know for certain is that it brought him a great deal of anguish. And the vagueness of this passage where it gives Paul's description of the thorn, it actually allows for Paul and for us to focus not on the thorn itself, but rather on the result of him having that thorn. And the result was that he learned to trust God. So what we're going to do today, we're going to take a look at what Paul learned about trusting God through this process of dealing with this great thorn in his life. And we're not going to focus on what the thorn is, we're going to focus more on the results. So let's walk through Paul's story and let's see what he learned about trusting God with his life, even though it was probably one of the toughest things that he had to face. So I believe that Paul learned some important lessons from this thorn. I believe that he actually learned 3 very important lessons about trusting God through the experience of having this thorn in his flesh. And he shared those 3 lessons that he learned with us in this passage. He wrote it down for us. And so what I want to do is I want to look at those 3 lessons that he learned about trusting God, and I want us to see how we can apply them in our lives today. So the first lesson that you see that Paul learned about trusting God, what I believe him to have learned is this: that trusting God means following him even when we don't get our own way. That's tough for us. We like to get our own way. We like things to go our way. We like things to be done the way that we've always done them. We like for things to go out and be the way that we would anticipate them or would choose for ourselves. We like getting stuff our way. We do this from a very young age. We like stuff our way. But in the very beginning of this passage, Paul tells us that he had to learn that it wasn't about him getting his way. Look back at what he said at the beginning of this passage in verse 7. He said, so to keep me from being conceited, from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. So there's this popular misconception out there in the world today, and it often creeps into the modern church. People have a tendency to think something along the lines of, well, doesn't God just want me to be happy? Doesn't God just want me to have a good life and to be happy in my life and to not have difficulties or pain? Isn't that what God's desire for my life is? And this is why we see people that are having adulterous affairs, or people that are divorcing their spouses, or cheating on their taxes, or doing any number of other sinful actions. And they do this, and they try to justify their actions by claiming God's desire for them to be happy. Oh, doesn't God just want me to be happy? I mean, if he wanted me to be happy and I'm not happy, then surely this situation is not for me. And we'll even misconstrue Bible verses like Psalm 37:4 that says, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And we take verses like that, and for some reason we think that verses like this teach us that as long as we say we love God, As long as we say that God is the desire of our hearts, then he's going to give us anything we want. But this is so far from the truth. As we already discussed earlier, we know that Paul's got this thorn in the flesh and we have no idea what it is. But what we do know about it is that he desperately wanted to get rid of it. He wanted it out. And in this instance, Paul, he knew exactly what he wanted and what would make him happy. What he wanted was to get rid of the thing that was plaguing him. He wanted to get rid of the thing that was hurting him. And so he begged God, it says 3 times, to take it away from him. But God's answer? It was no. On a quick side note, let me say I once heard a pastor teach, and I've actually heard other people say since then, that you should only have to pray for something one time. How many times do you have to pray for something? Just once. Anything more than that is a lack of faith on your part. But passages like this where Paul prays 3 times that God would take it away, or even last week's passage is probably more telling, where Jesus prays the same prayer multiple times in the garden before going to the cross. And I mean, you could add those to any number of parables that Jesus taught about the persistence that we're supposed to have in prayer and how we're supposed to continually ask and continually seek and continually knock. All these passages teach that we're supposed to pray doggedly. We're supposed to pray repeatedly for the things that God puts on our hearts. So don't ever let somebody tell you that you have a lack of faith because you take the same prayer to God over and over again. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to take the things that are important to us to our God. Okay, that's it. My rant is over. Let's get back to what God was teaching Paul. And in this passage, one thing is really, really clear. What we see is that God wasn't interested in Paul getting his own way. That's why Paul was able to pray 3 times and God said no. God was interested not in Paul getting his own way. What he was interested in was God's will being done in Paul's life. Paul was supposed to trust God. Even when Paul didn't get his own way, even when he didn't understand, even when things were not going the way that he would have hoped or would have dreamed, God wanted his will in Paul's life. And the interesting thing is that God definitely did have a plan for this difficulty in Paul's life. We don't always see God's plan in times of difficulty. We don't always see God's plan when we don't get our own way. But in this case, we do. Much like we talked about last week, how God was working towards a greater good in our lives through the death of Jesus. In this instance, we see that God is working toward a greater good in Paul's life. According to verse 7, God's plan for this thorn in Paul's life, it was to keep him humble. It was to keep him from becoming conceited. If you go back just a couple of verses, you can see why this was necessary. You remember he referenced in order to keep me from being conceited because of the greatness of my revelations. Look back at verse 1 in this passage, and you see why this was necessary. You see about that revelation that he's talking about. In verse 1, in chapter 12, verse 1, he says, "I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord." And then he says this weird kind of cryptic thing. He says, "I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven. Whether in body or out of body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears in me." So in this passage, it might seem a little weird to you, but Paul tells us about a guy that he knows who received this vision, this revelation of God, and he was taken up into what Paul calls the 3rd heaven. Whatever that means, we don't know. But this guy got to see God in ways that he couldn't even express, in words that couldn't be uttered. And Paul says that guy, he has reason to boast. And most scholars, including myself, though I wouldn't call myself a scholar, most scholars believe that Paul is talking about himself here. Otherwise, why would he say that he was given a thorn in the flesh to keep him humble from boasting about his revelations? He even says in verse 7, it's because of these surpassingly great revelations that he needs to stay humble. I mean, it's pretty evident here that Paul, he's talking about himself, and he's saying that he's the one who could brag about these visions of God. And it's not just these visions that Paul had reason to brag about. Paul was actually able to brag about a lot of stuff. Look at what he wrote to the church in Philippi. In Philippians chapter 3, he's talking about why he has the ability to boast. And he says this, he says, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has a reason for confidence in the flesh, I have far more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness, under the law, blameless. Paul is telling the church in Philippi that he was a Jew among Jews. He had all the reasons to boast as a Jew. Everything that made a Jew an awesome Jew, he had that. And not only was he a Jew among Jews, he became a Christian among Christians. I mean, he became the guy that everyone wanted to model their lives after in the church. If anyone had the right to boast about his accomplishments, it was Paul. But God had other plans for him. He could have been conceited. Paul could have gotten every bit of conceit in him possible because he had every right to be. But God had better plans for him. At least that's what we learned from our passage today. I mean, look back at verse 7. It says, so to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being conceited. You see it a couple of different times there. God used this seemingly bad situation for good in Paul's life. And Paul learned a valuable lesson in the process. Paul learned that even though we may be in the midst of some really difficult times, even though we might be going through the hardest times we've ever known, times that we can't understand, we can look at those difficulties with a heavenly perspective and believe that God can use even them for good in our lives. That's trust. That's what biblical trust is. It's not about us getting our own way. It's not about us getting the things that we would choose for ourselves. It's about us trusting that God's will is being done in our lives. That's a tough lesson, but it was one that Paul really needed to learn. And it's not the only lesson that Paul learned about trusting God. If we keep reading in this passage, we see that Paul also learned a second lesson about trusting God. He learned that trusting God means obeying God even when it's uncomfortable, even when it hurts, even when it's difficult. Trusting God is obeying God even in those difficult times. I mean, let's be honest, trust seems easy when times are easy. But true trust is proven most when the times get tough. It's easy to say that you trust someone when it costs you nothing. It's much harder when your trust gets tested by difficulties. I mean, look back at the passage as it continues. We saw in verse 7 that we're supposed to keep from being, and Paul was given this thorn to keep him from being conceited, this messenger of Satan to harass him, and he reiterates, in order to keep me from being conceited, this thorn in the flesh was given to him. And then he says in verse 8, he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. The word that's used here in this passage for thorn, it doesn't denote one of those little splinters that annoys the fire out of you. It doesn't denote the thing that I get all the time while I'm woodworking, something that goes underneath my skin and it just bugs me to the point that I have to go in and either pick it out with some tweezers or dig it out somehow. Those are never fun, but that's not exactly torment. The kinds of thorns that we're talking about in this passage are much different than what you get from a little twig. And this word isn't even the one that's used to describe the crown of thorns that's worn by Jesus on the cross. Those were much larger thorns, and arguably much more painful. But this word, the Greek word that's used here, literally means a sharp stake. I can't talk sometimes. A sharp stake used for impaling. Probably felt like a shark. I mean, that sounds pretty unpleasant to me. The word that's used here is actually, it denotes like a pylon that was sharpened to a point and people could be impaled on it. It was a form of execution. This is not pleasant. So much so that Paul said he repeatedly pled with the Lord and he begged God that it would be taken away from him. Paul thought, surely God doesn't want me to be in pain, right? Surely God wouldn't want me to experience this pain and this difficulty, right? His assumption, however, was wrong. Sure, I mean, God ultimately does not want his children to be in pain. But it's very important that we qualify that statement with the word ultimately. Think of it like a parent. Think of it as a parent. You don't want your kid to experience pain. I don't want my kids to experience pain. But your higher goal for them is for them to live their best life and their longest life that they could possibly live. What you want them to do is to live a life that is good. You don't want to remove pain at the cost of them living a good life. That's why we're willing to punish our kids. We punish them in order to bring about a greater good in their lives. We do things that brings them pain, whether it's physical punishment or something like taking away something. We do things to our kids to punish them in order to bring about a greater good in their lives. We allow pain to enter into their lives in order to direct them to a greater good. And other times, we might even allow them to stubbornly pursue something that we know is going to bring about pain in their lives. We might let them pull the tail of the cat or stick their hand into a thorn bush in order to allow them to learn the hard way that they need to listen to us. Because it's later when we're telling them something more important, like don't play in the street, or don't swing the cat around by his tail. Something that's going to cost them more. That's when we want them to know that they can trust us and need to listen to us for their greatest good. I know it's hard to think of difficulties that you're facing right now as something that God would allow or even orchestrate in your life. Because right now, you see how painful your circumstances are. You see how difficult your times are right now. But for a moment, just imagine with me. Imagine that it just might be possible that God is allowing such difficulty in your life in order to lead you to something greater than you would have ever chosen without the difficulty in your life. I mean, he's using your difficulties right now to lead you to something greater, and that greater thing is him. He's using your difficulties to lead you to a deeper and better relationship with him. Think of it this way. Who among us would ever claim, the times that I grew the closest to God in my life were the times that I was most comfortable or most at ease, the times that I didn't have a care in the world. Who says that? Nobody, if I were to go through every single person watching this video today and say, when are the times that you grew the most? Nobody would ever say the times that I didn't have a care in the world. The times that we grow are the times that we face trials and troubles. God knows that. And he knew that Paul would grow the most through this thorn in his flesh, not through comfort and not through ease. And after Paul repeatedly prayed that God would take away the thorn, God answered him and said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." We don't use that word sufficient often in the American way of life. We're not looking to live sufficient lives. We want abundant lives. We want more. We want always more and more and more. We're not looking for just to have a sufficient life. But when you see the word sufficient, you can substitute a really simple word in this and just know that sufficient means enough. He said, my grace is sufficient. My grace is enough. God looked at Paul and he plainly stated, my grace is enough for you. If we have God, if we have his grace in our lives, then we have all we need. We can be obedient to God even if we have nothing else. If we have God, we have enough. God didn't want Paul to focus on his comfort. He wanted Paul to focus on his obedience to God. Trusting God, it often means overlooking our own sense of comfort, our own sense of ease, in order to follow God wherever he leads us. And it means trusting that God will give us everything we need in order to follow him in obedience wherever he leads. You might be facing the hardest time that you've ever faced in your life right now. I get it. It's tough. Times are tough right now. But I want to encourage you with the truth that if you have God in your life, if you have him, you have everything you need. You have everything you need to either get through this time of difficulty or to die in the process, because God's grace is enough. And it's kind of important to note here that God never really promises that he's going to take away the thorn from Paul. He never answers, I'll take that away. He just says to Paul that he gives him this one promise. He says, what you need is me, and I'm with you. And I am enough to sustain you. There's this beautiful quote by Elisabeth Elliot, who is a woman who was well acquainted with grief and difficulty. She is the wife of Jim Elliot, one of the martyred missionaries in Ecuador that you may have heard about. She actually had another husband who died a couple of years after marrying him. She married again later in life. She went through all kinds of grief and difficulty, and I think she knew a lot about suffering. And she once said that she had this quote that says that God has promised to supply our needs. What we don't have now, we don't need now. Think about that. Think about those words for a second. What we don't have now, we don't need now. If God has promised our sufficiency, if he has promised to supply everything that we need, enough of what we need, if he's promised that, he says, if we need it, we'll have it. If you need it to get through this time, you'll have it. He's promised that. So logically speaking, if we don't have it, then we must not really need it right now. God has promised that we have all we need. We have him. And trusting him means believing that, even when our times get difficult or uncomfortable. That's tough. Yet it's a beautiful, beautiful truth to learn. But it still wasn't all that Paul learned about trusting God in this passage. There's one final truth that I believe Paul learned through this experience of the thorn in his flesh. And that truth is found in the final verses of the passage. Paul learned trusting God means relying on him more than we rely on ourselves. Look back at how the passage ends. He says in verse 8, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And he goes on and he says, for the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, with insults, with hardships, with persecutions, with calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. We like to think of ourselves as spiritual supermen. We think that our particular area of ministry or our service, it won't happen unless we do it in our way, in our strength, in our time. We think that God somehow needs us to carry out his mission here on this earth, and we think that he needs us to carry out the mission that he has in and through the church. And I fully believe that Paul, when he was praying this prayer, he was praying completely selflessly. It was so selfless here. He probably was praying it something like, God, please just take this thorn away so that I can be better equipped and more capable to do the ministry that you've asked me to do. And I want to be better. I want to be more equipped to be what you want me to be. So take this thorn away so that I can be everything that you want me to be. But God's response was pretty telling here. God says his strength is made perfect when we are weak. How can this be? How can God's strength be most complete in us when we are at our weakest? I think it's because of one very simple truth. It's because when God uses unworthy tools to do amazing things, that's when he alone can get the glory for it. I mean, think about it. If a person were to use Photoshop to create a picture of Kendall's face on the body of the Mona Lisa, something that I would highly recommend if you have the skills to do, post it on our group page. Do it soon. If somebody were to take Kendall's face and use Photoshop and post it on the Mona Lisa and make it look believable, then people might look at that picture and they would say, man, Photoshop is really amazing. It's such a cool tool to be able to Photoshop stuff like that. But here's the deal. If somebody were to take a bunch of mud and maybe some berry juice and to smash it together and make paint and then come up to the church and to paint a giant mural on the side of the church building that depicted the exact same picture, which I would decidedly not recommend anyone try. If somebody did that, then our first thought would be, man, whoever did that is really amazing. They are such a good artist. How on earth could they do that with such simple tools? It's the same way we feel when we look at something that was hand carved versus something that was made by a CNC machine, like the CNC router. A CNC router is it's a really cool machine. You plug and play, you put a design into the computer, you tell it what to carve out, and it carves it. I mean, computers are amazing. They can do some really cool stuff. But we don't get amazed by them in the same way that we do when we look at something that a real person, took just basic hand carving tools and made this incredible work of art out of. When we see that, we praise the person. We don't praise the tool. If a person uses crude tools to accomplish a great task, then it's the person who gets the credit for the creativity. And when God uses completely unworthy vessels like me and like you to accomplish his great mission on earth, guess who gets all the glory for what he's doing? It's not me and it's not you. It's God. When we do things out of our own comfort zone, things that could not be explained by our own strength or our own power, things that are beyond our training, beyond our skill level, beyond our ability, when we do stuff like that can't be explained by me or you, then the only way to explain it is God is working through us. And that's what Christianity is all about. When we're serious about trusting God, even in the most difficult times, God uses those situations to bring himself glory. Because that's when we point people back to Jesus. We point people to God with our actions. When they see that we're doing things that can only be explained by God himself, that's when God gets the glory. So think about it. If trusting God is about following him instead of getting our way, if it's about obeying him, even when we're uncomfortable or in difficulties, and if it's about relying on him instead of relying on ourselves, then it seems like it really just comes down to one truth. That Christianity is much more about him than it is about us. And here's the crazy thing. That hasn't changed during this coronavirus. Christianity is still more about him than it is about us. Our trust for God isn't supposed to disappear just because the world is different than it's ever been in our lifetime. Our trust for God doesn't deteriorate simply because our lives have become less stable or more difficult. Our trust for God should actually be growing through this time. Right now, through these difficulties, our faith in him should be growing. That's how it happened in Paul's life through this thorn in the flesh. And that's actually exactly how it happened with my relationship with Erin. As we went through more and more difficulties together, she never let me down, I never let her down, and we learned to trust each other more and more. And that's why she's at the top of my list, because I've experienced that with her. How much more should this be true of our God? Last week we celebrated the ultimate reason to trust him. I mean, he came to this earth took on flesh and died in our place on that cross. He sacrificed himself for us. Let that sink in for just a second. The undying creator of life died for you. He stepped in and he put himself in your place of execution. Jesus is the perfect proof that we can trust God, even in this crazy time. So today, I just want to encourage you to see this time of isolation. In this time of difficulty, I want you to see it as an opportunity to trust him. Trust him more now than you ever have. Trust him more because of your difficulties. Because it's not about you. Trusting God means following him even when we don't get our own way. And it means obeying God even when it takes us out of our comfort zone. Even if it hurts. And it means relying on God more than we rely on ourselves. We know that we can trust God. We know that. He's proven himself trustworthy time and time again. He went to a cross for me and for you. He stood in our place in order to prove to you that you can trust him. He offered to save you by sacrificing himself. I don't know what more there is to trust. So the question comes that comes from this is, will you be more like Paul and have to learn this the hard way? Or are you willing to actually learn from Paul's example that God is worthy of your trust? He is so incredibly trustworthy. You can trust him today. So as you go about your week, show everyone that you come in contact with, which might just be the people in your household. Show them that you trust God by the attitude that you take about this virus and the difficulties that you're facing in it. He's worthy of your trust. So let's show people that we trust him this week. Hey everybody, we have a couple of quick announcements for you. The first one is kind of ironic because we talked about difficulties and trusting God throughout the difficulties, but I've kind of been going through a difficulty of my own that I wanted to share with you guys. So I've been bugged, I've been harassed, I've been argued with. And quite frankly, I'm getting a little tired of it, so I'm giving in. My kids have been wanting to be a part of a video ever since we started, so today they're gonna help me with the announcement time. Yay! Welcome, guys. How do you feel about being in the video?
Good. Excited.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, Reagan, let's start with you. You've been working on some comics for your group called Church Comics, Inc. Mm-hmm. Is that right? So you've been...
Comics with an X.
Comics with an X, obviously. So tell us a little bit about what that is and what we can expect from that.
Okay, so at Church Comics Inc., we have decided, since normally we sell our comics and we hand them out at church, well, we're going to be taking pictures of them and posting them on the Renascent Church Facebook page.
The group, not the page. The internal group.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a difference.
I don't really know.
And how much will these comics cost us, someone might ask?
They are free.
Free!
It's special for the coronavirus.
So you and your friends have been working on some comics that you want to share. So when can we expect to see those?
Probably next week, maybe the week after that.
Soon. Let's work on them so we can get them on there soon, all right? Evan, you have been talking to us a little bit about some of the things that you've missed. So tell us what you've missed most about our church gatherings.
We don't get to go to Dickies.
That's what you miss most? You don't get to go out to eat afterwards?
Except it's not out to eat, it's Dickies.
I am a very bad parent.
And Sully always comes with us.
Tell me what you've missed about specifically the church gathering.
We don't get to meet with friends.
You don't get to see your friends? What about you?
Well, normally we draw Pokemon with Sully while we listen to the sermon on Family Day.
Oh, wow.
So now my
Pokemon and Dickies. You've heard it right here from Pastor's Kids.
My Pokemon notebook is becoming very empty.
All right, well, maybe we can work on that soon. I have an announcement that has nothing to do with these guys. I wanted to tell you all thank you, because you have been so incredibly faithful in your giving as of late. It has been amazing for us to see that while lots of churches around us are kind of scrambling to get people to give, y'all have been very, very faithful, and we haven't missed a beat. In fact, I think we've had, the last month was the most we've ever brought in a single month. So for that, I want to say thank you and props to you guys. And because of that, I wanted to share with you a little bit about some of the good that we've been able to do because of your giving. So with us having a surplus, we met with the elders recently, and we discussed a need that had come to our attention. And there was a local church that we have a connection with that actually has had a pretty serious deficit, and we were able to actually give them a little extra money this month. Just something that's like no strings attached. Here's a gift from our church to help you guys out. And I wanted to say to y'all that your money is going to help in building the kingdom in ways that have nothing to do with our church. So from your leadership to you, I wanted to say thank you for being willing to make an impact on the kingdom. It is an awesome thing to see, so keep up the good work. Now, probably the biggest announcement that we have is a question that everybody's wanting to ask, and that question is this.
When are we going to get to meet again?
Wow, we botched that. When do we get to meet again? That is what people have been asking us, and unfortunately we're not certain, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel at this point. So our leadership in the state they're currently meeting to talk about when to reopen business as usual, and we don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know if it's going to be a slow and gradual rollout. We don't know if they're just going to open up the state again, but we're waiting on them to make an announcement about their recommendations for reopening the state and the businesses here in our state. So we're keeping a very close eye on it right now, and as soon as we hear from our health and our state officials, we're going to be able to make the most informed decision about our church specifically. So just keep doing what you're doing. I know it's tough to say hurry up and wait, but hunker down, and we'll be back together as soon as possible while also being wise as a group. So just hang in there. We're getting close. Now, the final announcement that we have for you is this. This is kind of what it looks like. I mean, this is somewhat what it looks like. You guys, stop it. Seriously, chill up. Chill. Whenever we meet for worship on Sundays at the Hayes household. So obviously we've got a little bit more chaos because we've got a couple of other people thrown in the mix, but this is kind of what you see. I want to know what it looks like at your house. I want to know what things look like whenever you are sitting down to watch the video together as a family. So here's what we're asking you to do. I want you to snap a quick picture right now and post it in the comment section, either on our Facebook page in the comments under the video, or on the YouTube in the comments under the video, if that's possible on YouTube. Either way, I want to know what it looks like for you. So show us what it's like at your household. Show us if you're all alone. Show us how lonely you are. If you've got your family around you, show us that, and let us see what it's like whenever you get together to gather together for worship every Sunday. And I want to be encouraged just to see you guys again. So post a picture in the comments. Know that we love you guys. It's going to be great to see you again soon. And until then, bye.
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 Happy Sunday, everybody.